In the cold waiting room of St. Mary's Hospital, a desperate mother clutches her feverish child, begging for help. Dr. Harris Whitaker, the hospital's most respected surgeon, coldly walks past them without a second glance. "Medical refusal authorized," he mutters, before disappearing behind swinging doors. But when the clipboard with the mother's name slides across his desk minutes later, his world shatters completely. 20 years of buried secrets. A family torn apart by lies. A dying boy who might never know the truth. What could make a doctor refuse to help a child in desperate need? And what shocking revelation about Ruth Ann Blythe's identity will force Dr. Whitaker to confront the past he's spent 2 decades trying to forget? Some wounds never heal until they're finally exposed to the light. Follow, like, and comment to let us know where you're watching from. The most shocking family secret is about to be revealed. The child was shivering. It wasn't just the fever. It was the cold linoleum floor of the emergency room, where he lay on a thin blanket, his lips turning purple and his eyes closed from exhaustion. 8-year-old Micah Blythe had been fighting whatever was ravaging his small body for 3 days now, but tonight something had changed. His breathing had become shallow, his skin burning to the touch, yet somehow clammy at the same time. Ruth Ann Blythe clutched her son's tiny hand, her eyes darting desperately around the crowded waiting room of St. Mary's Hospital in Bayou Creek, Louisiana. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across her weathered face, highlighting the dark circles under her eyes and the worry lines that had formed over years of struggle. "Please," she begged the receptionist for the 3rd time in an hour, her voice cracking. "His temperature's 104. He's barely responding anymore. Please." The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with hair pulled back too tight and lips pressed into a permanent frown, barely looked up from her computer screen. "Without insurance, we can't prioritize triage. You'll have to wait your turn, ma'am." Ruth Ann felt a tear slide down her cheek. "He's been waiting for hours. Look at him." Nobody seemed to care. The night shift was always understaffed at St. Mary's, and the few nurses on duty hurried past with charts clutched to their chests, too busy to notice the woman in the worn denim jacket kneeling beside her son on the waiting room floor. The boy had been too weak to sit in a chair, and Ruth Ann had given up trying to hold him. That's when Dr. Harris Whitaker walked by, his white coat immaculate, his posture rigid as a soldier's. At 45, he was the hospital's most respected physician, and its coldest. The nurses called him Doctor, Iceman behind his back, not just for his clinical precision, but for the way he could look through patients as if they were merely puzzles to solve rather than people in pain. Ruth Ann's eyes widened with desperate hope. She scrambled to her feet, positioning herself directly in his path. "Doctor, please, my son needs help. You're the only doctor on this floor right now." Harris didn't even break stride. His steel blue eyes flickered over her, taking in the mud-stained jeans, the tangled hair, the desperation, and then shifted to the boy on the floor. Something clinical registered in his gaze, the labored breathing, the pallor beneath the fever flush. For a split second, Ruth Ann thought he might stop. Instead, he stepped around her. "Medical refusal authorized," he muttered dryly, disappearing behind the swinging doors to the treatment area. "What kind of doctor are you?" Ruth Ann screamed after him, her voice echoing in the sterile hallway. The few patients waiting turned to stare, but she didn't care. She fell to her knees beside Micah, gathered him into her arms, and sobbed. A young nurse approached, her face a mask of apologetic helplessness. "Ma'am, if you could just fill out these forms completely. Sometimes the doctor reconsiders." Ruth Ann grabbed the clipboard, her hands trembling so badly she could barely hold the pen. She filled in what she could. Micah Andrew Blythe, age 8, allergies, penicillin. Past medical history, asthma. Current medications, none. They'd run out of his inhaler last month. Insurance, none. She paused at the line requesting her own information. With a deep breath, she wrote, "Ruth Ann Marie Blythe." The nurse took the clipboard and disappeared behind the same doors Dr. Whitaker had entered. In the small consultation room where he was reviewing charts, she placed the form on top of his stack. "Doctor, the woman with the boy in the waiting room. I said I'm not taking any more walk-ins tonight, Nurse Jenkins. The ER is backed up as it is. But, sir, the child looks really sick. I think—" "What you think doesn't matter," he cut her off, not looking up from his computer. "Hospital policy is clear. No insurance, back of the line." Nurse Jenkins placed the clipboard directly in front of him. "Just look at the chart, sir." With an irritated sigh, Harris glanced down. His eyes scanned the form perfunctorily until they stopped at the mother's information. The world froze for a second. Ruth Ann Marie Blythe. The letters seemed to tremble on the paper. The name he had tried to bury 20 years ago. The name of the woman he had loved and destroyed. The past shattered into the present like a bolt of lightning. Harris dropped the clipboard. The sound of plastic hitting the floor echoed in the small room. For the first time in years, the color drained from his face. Without thinking, he ran. Back in the waiting room, Ruth Ann was rocking Micah gently, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. "Hang on, baby, Mama's here, help is coming." The doors burst open. Dr. Whitaker stood there, his composed demeanor shattered, his eyes wild as they landed on Ruth Ann. For a moment, they just stared at each other across 20 years of silence and secrets. Ruthie, the nickname fell from his lips before he could stop it, the name only he had ever called her. The clipboard had slid out from under the door. Ruth Ann saw it there, saw her own name circled in frantic pen strokes. She understood immediately. She looked up at him, her face streaked with tears, and spoke the words that would change everything. "If he dies, Harris, he dies without ever knowing." Harris felt the world tilt beneath his feet. He barked orders at the stunned staff. "Get a gurney here now, start a saline IV, push ceftriaxone, and prep the pediatric ICU." As they rushed Micah into treatment, Ruth Ann's words echoed in Harris's mind. Without ever knowing what, or knowing whom, the past he had tried so desperately to forget was suddenly the only thing that mattered. And the boy, this boy who might be his son, was fighting for his life. Micah was rushed through the swinging doors on a gurney that seemed too large for his small frame. Harris barked orders with mechanical precision, his doctor's instincts taking over, while his mind reeled from the shock of seeing Ruth Ann again. The boy's condition was critical: 104.3 fever, rapid shallow breathing, blood pressure dangerously low. The initial diagnosis was grim, advanced septicemia. The infection had likely started as something simple, perhaps a cut or scrape, but had now invaded his bloodstream, poisoning him from within. "Start broad-spectrum antibiotics immediately," Harris commanded the team. "I want blood cultures, a complete blood count and a chest x-ray, and get me an ultrasound of his abdomen." His voice was steady, betraying none of the earthquake happening inside him. Through the glass window of the treatment room, Harris stole glances at Ruth Ann, who paced anxiously in the hallway. She was different now. The vibrant, laughing girl with fiery eyes had been replaced by a woman worn down by life. Her once glossy auburn hair now hung limp around her shoulders, streaked with premature gray. The curve of her cheeks had hollowed, and lines of worry had etched themselves permanently around her eyes and mouth. But there was something else there too. Something he couldn't quite decipher. A quiet strength, a resilience that had survived whatever had broken her down. What had she meant by those words? "He dies without ever knowing." Without knowing what? Or whom? The monitors beeped ominously as Micah's oxygen levels dipped. Harris focused back on the child, pushing aside the questions hammering at his mind. "Push another dose of epinephrine," he ordered, "and get that central line in now." Nurse Jenkins worked efficiently beside him, her earlier annoyance replaced by professional respect for the way Dr. Whitaker had suddenly transformed from indifferent to intensely focused. "His white count is off the charts," she murmured, showing him the preliminary lab results. "This infection's been brewing for days," Harris muttered, more to himself than to her. Why didn't she bring him in sooner? The question escaped before he could stop it. Jenkins glanced at him curiously. "Some folks can't afford to miss work for a sick kid, Dr. Whitaker. Not until it's an emergency." The gentle rebuke stung Harris more than it should have. How much had he forgotten about the world Ruth Ann came from? The Ruth Ann he knew had lived in a small rental house on the wrong side of Bayou Creek. Her father a handyman who died young, her mother cleaning houses to support 3 children. The Whitakers, meanwhile, owned half the businesses in town, their sprawling estate overlooking the very bayou that gave the town its name. Back then, Harris had thought love could bridge those worlds. He'd been naive. In the waiting area, Ruth Ann clutched her son's worn jean jacket, pulling it close like a lifeline. She'd grabbed it in their rush to the hospital, and now she held it against her chest, inhaling the scent of pine and earth that always clung to Micah. He loved exploring the woods behind their trailer, collecting rocks and feathers, building forts from fallen branches. So different from his father in that way. As she hugged the jacket, something fell from its pocket, a folded piece of construction paper. She picked it up with trembling fingers. It was a drawing Micah had made in school last week, the one he'd been so secretive about. The teacher had called it his Father's Day project, not realizing the minefield she was walking into. Ruth Ann hadn't had the heart to tell Micah not to participate. She unfolded it now. The crude crayon drawing showed a tall stick figure next to a smaller one. Above them, written in Micah's careful printing, "For my dad, even though I don't know who you are." Tears welled in her eyes. Harris emerged from the treatment room just in time to see the paper slip from Ruth Ann's fingers as she wiped her eyes. He bent to retrieve it, his doctor's instinct to keep the floor clear overriding his personal turmoil. Before he could hand it back, his eyes caught the childish writing, the crude drawing, the words that punched him in the gut. His hands trembled, the handwriting and the content. Could it be possible? Was Micah his son, or was this just a cruel coincidence? "We've stabilized him for now," Harris said, his voice strangely formal as he handed back the drawing. "But he'll need surgery to drain an abscess we found near his appendix. It's likely the source of the infection." Ruth Ann nodded mutely, folding the drawing and slipping it into her pocket. "Ruth Ann," he said, the name feeling foreign on his tongue after all these years. "I need to know, is he—" "Not here," she interrupted, her voice low. "Not now." In the operating room, Harris scrubbed his hands methodically, watching the soap bubbles spiral down the drain like the thoughts in his mind. 20 years ago, Ruth Ann had said words he'd never forgotten. "If you leave me now, don't ever look back." But here he was, looking back, and for the first time, wondering what else she might have hidden from him. His hands shook slightly as he approached the operating table where Micah lay, small and vulnerable under the harsh lights. The surgical team waited, watching with surprise, as the normally steady Dr. Whitaker fumbled with his gloves. "Everything all right, doctor?" the anesthesiologist asked. Harris nodded curtly, forcing his hands to steady. "Let's save this boy," he said, his voice carrying more weight than anyone in the room could understand. But as he made the first incision, all he could hear were Ruth Ann's words from 20 years ago echoing in his mind. "Some secrets are better left buried, Harris, just like us." The surgery lasted 3 hours and 17 minutes. Every second felt like an eternity to Harris as he meticulously drained the abscess and cleaned the infection that had been slowly poisoning Micah's small body. The boy's appendix had been inflamed, but not yet ruptured. A small mercy in an otherwise dire situation. Throughout the procedure, Harris worked with the focused precision that had earned him his reputation, but inside, he was anything but calm. When it was finally over, and Micah had been wheeled to recovery, Harris found himself alone in the surgical locker room. He stripped off his blood-spattered gown, balled it up, and threw it with unusual force into the biohazard bin. Then he stood before the sink, turned the water to scalding, and scrubbed his hands until they were raw and red, as if he could somehow wash away the past as easily as surgical soap. He looked up at his reflection in the mirror above the sink. Who was this man staring back at him? The sharp cheekbones, the permanently furrowed brow, the steel gray creeping into his once dark hair at the temples. When had he become this person? A man who would turn away a sick child. A man who had buried his heart so deeply he could barely recognize it anymore. "Damn it," he whispered, and to his horror, felt his eyes burn with tears for the first time in years. Not tears of relief for a successful surgery, but tears of shame, regret, and a sudden overwhelming sense of everything he'd lost. He gripped the edge of the sink until his knuckles turned white, fighting for control. The door to the locker room swung open. Harris quickly splashed cold water on his face, desperate to hide any evidence of his momentary weakness. Dr. Whitaker. It was Dr. Eliza Chen, the pediatric specialist, who would be overseeing Micah's post-op care. "The boy's stable, but he's not out of the woods. We've got him on a heavy antibiotic cocktail, but the infection was extensive." She paused, studying him. "Are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." Harris straightened his shoulders, slipping back into the cool, clinical demeanor that had become his armor. "I'm fine. Just a long surgery." "You know, it's strange," Dr. Chen continued, head tilted curiously. "You don't usually take emergency pediatric cases, especially not for uninsured patients. Anderson was on call tonight." "Anderson's an idiot," Harris snapped, with more emotion than he'd intended. Dr. Chen's eyebrows shot up, but she didn't comment further. "Well, the mother's asking for you. She's in the waiting room." Harris nodded, his throat suddenly dry. I'll be there in a minute." When Dr. Chen left, Harris sank onto a bench, his legs suddenly unsteady. He needed to know the truth. Was Micah his son? The timing could work. Ruth Ann had disappeared from Bayou Creek almost exactly 9 years ago, after their final explosive fight. But if it were true, why hadn't she told him? Why come back now, after all this time? Gathering what remained of his composure, Harris made his way to the waiting room. Ruth Ann was alone, curled into a corner chair, her arms wrapped around herself as if she were cold, though the Louisiana hospital was stiflingly warm even in December. She looked up when he entered, her green eyes, still as startling as he remembered, locking onto his. "He's going to make it," Harris said without preamble. "The infection was bad, but we caught it in time. He'll need to stay here for at least a week on IV antibiotics." Relief washed over Ruth Ann's face, and she sagged deeper into the chair. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice raw from crying. Harris sat down across from her, maintaining a careful distance. "Ruth Ann," he said quietly, "we need to talk." She looked at him wearily. "I know, but not here. Too many ears in a hospital. My office, then. Now." It wasn't a request. 10 minutes later, they sat across from each other in Harris's immaculate office, the door firmly closed against the hospital's bustle. Awards and diplomas lined the walls, testament to the successful life he'd built after she'd left, or after he'd driven her away. The narrative shifted depending on who was telling the story. "Is he mine?" Harris asked bluntly, unable to bear the suspense any longer. Ruth Ann's eyes widened briefly before her expression closed off. "If I tell you the truth, you'll hate me even more than you already do." "I don't hate you, Ruthie," he said, the old nickname slipping out despite his best efforts. "I never did." "Could have fooled me," she murmured, twisting the frayed sleeve of her jacket. Harris leaned forward, his patience wearing thin. "Is Micah my son? Yes or no?" Ruth Ann took a deep breath, her shoulders squaring as if preparing for battle. "No," she said finally. "He's not your son." A pause, laden with unspoken weight. "At least, not the way you're thinking." Harris stared at her, bewildered. "What the hell does that mean? Either he is or he isn't." "It's complicated, Harris." "Uncomplicate it," he demanded, anger rising to mask his confusion. Before Ruth Ann could answer, a sharp knock interrupted them. Nurse Jenkins poked her head in, her expression apologetic. "I'm sorry to interrupt, Dr. Whitaker, but there's someone here insisting on seeing Ms. Blythe. Says it's urgent." Harris was about to dismiss the interruption when a tall figure pushed past the nurse into the office. Time seemed to stop as Harris found himself staring into a face he hadn't seen in over 2 decades, a face that mirrored his own in so many ways, yet carried different scars. "Thomas," Harris breathed, the name like ashes in his mouth. Thomas Whitaker stood framed in the doorway, his broad shoulders filling the space, his dark hair longer than Harris remembered, streaked with the same premature gray. His eyes, identical to Harris's steel blue, darted from his brother to Ruth Ann, widening in surprise. "Ruthie!" Thomas's voice cracked. "They said at the motel that you'd rushed to the hospital." "Is it Micah? Is he—" "He's going to be okay," Ruth Ann said quickly, rising from her chair. "Harris, Dr. Whitaker performed the surgery himself." The brothers stared at each other across 20 years of silence. In Thomas's stance, the slightly defensive tilt of his shoulders, the protective way he looked at Ruth Ann, and most tellingly, the raw panic in his eyes when he mentioned the boy, Harris saw the truth that Ruth Ann had been trying to tell him. Micah wasn't Harris's son. He was Thomas's. And just like that, memories Harris had tried to bury resurfaced with painful clarity. Thomas and Ruth Ann laughing together at a summer barbecue, while Harris was too busy discussing business with their father. The way Ruth Ann's smile dimmed when Harris cancelled yet another date to work late at medical school. The betrayed look in Thomas's eyes the night Harris had accused him of trying to steal his girlfriend. Accusations fueled by jealousy and their father's manipulative whispers. "What are you doing here?" Harris finally asked, his voice cold despite the hurricane of emotions inside him. Thomas's jaw tightened. "I think you know exactly why I'm here, brother," he replied, the last word carrying 2 decades of unresolved pain. The tension in Harris's office was thick enough to cut with a scalpel. The 2 brothers stood facing each other like weathered boxers, neither willing to be the first to look away. Though they shared the same steel blue eyes, square jaw, and tall frame, unmistakably brothers, their lives had carved different lines into their faces. Harris's features were sharpened by ambition and precision. Thomas's were softened by years of outdoor work, his skin tanned and creased at the corners of his eyes. "We should talk about Micah," Thomas finally said, breaking the silence. "How bad is it, really?" Harris shifted into doctor mode, grateful for the professional shield it provided. "The infection was severe, septicemia from an abdominal abscess. We've drained it and started him on powerful antibiotics. He's stable but critical." He paused, then added with clinical detachment, "Why wasn't he brought in sooner?" "We don't have insurance," Ruth Ann answered, her voice tinged with defensiveness. "I tried the clinic in Moreau first, but they were closed for renovations. By the time I realized how serious it was," her voice trailed off, heavy with guilt. "You should have called me," Thomas said softly to Ruth Ann, though his eyes never left Harris. "I would have come back sooner." "Back from where exactly?" Harris couldn't help asking. "Alaska, wasn't it? That's what Father always said when anyone asked." "Thomas found his calling up in Alaska. Funny how no one could ever reach you there." Thomas's jaw clenched. "I wasn't in Alaska, but you never tried to reach me anyway, did you, Harris?" Ruth Ann stepped between them, her hands raised. "This isn't helping, Micah. I need to check on him." She turned to leave, then paused at the door. "For what it's worth, I never meant for any of this to happen. Not like this." The door closed behind her with a soft click that somehow felt more final than a slam. Left alone, the brothers fell into another loaded silence. Harris walked to his desk and sank into his chair, suddenly exhausted. "How long have you been back in Bayou Creek?" 3 days, Thomas replied, remaining standing. "I've been in Texas for years, oil rigs mostly. Ruthie called me last week, said she needed to come back home because her mom was dying. Cancer. She's at Shady Pines Hospice." He ran a hand through his hair, the same nervous gesture Harris remembered from childhood. "I couldn't let her face this place alone. Not after everything." Harris nodded, absorbing this information. Elaine Blythe dying. Another piece of the puzzle clicking into place. "And Micah? He's yours." Thomas met his gaze steadily. "Yes, he's mine." The confirmation hit Harris like a physical blow, though he'd already deduced the truth. 8 years old. Born a year after Ruth Ann had left town. The timing made perfect sense now. "Were you together before she left?" The question that had haunted Harris for 2 decades finally escaped his lips. Thomas shook his head. "Not the way you're thinking. We were friends, Harris. Just friends until..." "Until what?" Thomas sighed heavily. "Until the night of the Founders' Day party. After you two had that public fight, when you accused her of distracting you from your career, you left her crying on the balcony, remember?" Harris remembered. It had been their worst fight. Him, drunk on bourbon and his father's expectations, telling Ruth Ann she was holding him back. That medical school was his priority, not some small-town romance. Words he'd regretted the moment they left his mouth. "I found her there," Thomas continued. "I only meant to make sure she got home safe, but we talked all night. About you, about Father, about how trapped we both felt in this town." His voice grew quieter. "One night, Harris. That's all it was. A mistake born from pain and too much whiskey. The next morning we both agreed it could never happen again. She still loved you." Harris felt a strange hollowness expanding in his chest. "But she never came back to me." "She tried," Thomas said, his voice hardening. "She came to your apartment the next day to apologize for the fight. But you weren't alone." The memory clicked into place. Melissa Tanner, the pharmaceutical rep who'd been pursuing him for months, had shown up at his door with breakfast and an urgent discussion about a new drug trial. It had been innocent, or at least that's what Harris had told himself, but from the outside it wouldn't have looked that way. "By the time Ruthie found out she was pregnant," Thomas continued, "you'd already taken that fellowship in Chicago. Father made it very clear you'd moved on." Harris stood abruptly and walked to the window, needing space to process this revelation. Outside, the lights of Bayou Creek twinkled in the darkness, deceptively peaceful. Father knew about the pregnancy. "Of course he knew," Thomas replied bitterly. "Nothing happened in this town without Preston Whitaker finding out, especially not something that might tarnish the family name." A cold dread settled in Harris's stomach. He turned back to his brother. "What did he do?" Thomas's expression darkened. "Why don't you ask him? He's right upstairs in the VIP wing, isn't he? Room 407, private nurse, best view in the hospital. Same old Preston." Harris hadn't even realized his father was in the hospital. They barely spoke these days. Their relationship reduced to terse phone calls on holidays, and the occasional charity event where appearances needed to be maintained. "I need to look into something," Harris said suddenly, a memory stirring. "Father's old study at the house. Do you still have a key?" "No, but I know where the spare is hidden," Thomas replied. "Why?" "Just a hunch." Harris grabbed his coat. "Stay with Ruth Ann and Micah. I'll be back in an hour." The Whitaker family estate stood on the highest point in Bayou Creek, a sprawling colonial mansion surrounded by ancient oaks draped with Spanish moss. Harris hadn't been there in months, but the groundskeeper still maintained it immaculately, awaiting the rare occasions when Preston Whitaker returned from his retirement condo in Florida. Using Thomas's directions, Harris found the spare key inside a fake rock by the garden shed. The house was silent and dark as he entered, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor of the grand foyer. He made his way to his father's study, a room that had terrified him as a child, the place where disappointments were catalogued and punishments determined. The study remained unchanged, leather-bound books lining the walls, the massive oak desk dominating the center, the lingering smell of cigar smoke and bourbon. Harris went straight to the antique filing cabinet in the corner, the one place his father had always forbidden them to touch. Using a letter opener from the desk, he jimmied the lock open. Inside were dozens of meticulously labeled folders, business dealings, property deeds, and one labeled simply Family Matters. Harris pulled it out with trembling hands. Among the expected documents, birth certificates, insurance policies, his mother's will, he found a letter written in his mother's delicate handwriting, dated just before her death 15 years ago. It was addressed to him. "My dearest Harris," it began. "If you are reading this, then you have finally started asking the right questions. There are things about our family you need to know, things your father has hidden from you." The letter detailed how Preston had driven Thomas away after learning about Ruth Ann's pregnancy, threatening to cut him off completely, and using his influence to blacklist him from any decent job in Louisiana. But the most damning revelation came at the end. The shame of the family, as your father calls it, Thomas's child, deserves to know his heritage. If anything happens to me, tell Harris he must protect the boy as if he were his own, because he is the best part of Thomas, the son who truly inherited my heart rather than Preston's ambition. Harris sank into his father's chair, the letter clutched in his hand. All these years, his mother had known. She'd wanted him to protect Micah, his nephew, not his son, but the letter had never reached him. As the implications sank in, Harris noticed another folder labeled Thomas, Alaska. Inside were dozens of letters addressed to Harris and their mother, letters from Thomas that had never been delivered. And most damning of all, copies of letters supposedly from Harris to Thomas, filled with cruel words of rejection that Harris had never written. The truth crashed down on him with devastating clarity. His father hadn't just driven Thomas away, he deliberately kept the brothers apart, intercepting their communication, feeding them both lies to ensure the rift remained permanent. "God damn it, Father," Harris whispered into the empty room, 20 years of manipulated hurt finally finding its target. The rain started as Harris left the family estate, fat droplets splattering against his windshield like tears from an angry sky. He drove through the familiar streets of Bayou Creek, with his mother's letter burning a hole in his pocket, the wipers slashing back and forth in a rhythm that matched his racing heartbeat. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his mind replaying every moment, every conversation with his father over the past 20 years, searching for clues he should have seen. Thunder rumbled overhead as he pulled into the hospital parking lot. The storm seemed fitting, a physical manifestation of the tempest raging inside him. He sat in his car for a long moment, watching the raindrops distort the world beyond his windshield, much like how his father's manipulations had distorted his reality for decades. When he finally entered the hospital, he was soaked through, his expensive shoes squelching against the polished floor. He ignored the surprised looks from the night staff as he made his way to the pediatric ICU where Micah was recovering. Through the observation window, he could see Ruth Ann asleep in a chair beside the boy's bed, her hand resting protectively on his small arm. Thomas was nowhere to be seen. Nurse Jenkins approached quietly. "The boy's fever is down," she reported, misreading his presence as professional concern rather than the personal reckoning it was. Antibiotics seemed to be working. "Where's his father?" Harris asked, the word father feeling strange on his tongue when referring to Thomas. "Cafeteria, I think. Getting coffee." Jenkins hesitated, then added, "Dr. Whitaker, there's something else you should know." I found something unusual when I was filing Ms. Blythe's paperwork. Harris turned his full attention to her. What is it? An old envelope in the archives, marked with R. Blythe and stamped no paternal record. It's from 8 years ago. She handed him a yellowed envelope. Hospital policy is to destroy these after 7 years, but it was misfiled. I thought you might want to see it, given your interest in the case. Harris accepted the envelope with a nod of thanks, waiting until Jenkins had left before carefully opening it. Inside was a note on faded stationery that he instantly recognized as his mother's. The message was brief but devastating. If anything happens to me, tell Harris that he must protect the boy as if he were his own, because he is the best part of Thomas. Almost identical to the words in the letter he'd found at the estate, but this note had been left at the hospital. A backup plan his mother had created, perhaps knowing how thoroughly Preston Whitaker controlled the family communications. Harris's vision blurred. His mother, in her final days, had tried to reach across the void his father had created, to connect the fractured pieces of their family. And she'd failed, not through any fault of her own, but because Preston's influence had been too pervasive, his manipulation too complete. She knew she was dying, came a quiet voice behind him. Harris turned to find Thomas standing there, 2 coffee cups in his hands, his expression a complex mixture of grief and resignation. Mom came to see me once in secret, about a month before the end. She told me she'd tried to make things right, but Father had intercepted her letters. Harris swallowed hard, struggling to find his voice. I found those letters tonight, and others. Ones you supposedly sent me, full of anger and blame. I never wrote those, Thomas said immediately. I know that now. Harris ran a hand through his damp hair. Just like I never wrote the ones you received from me. The brothers stood in silence, absorbing the magnitude of their father's betrayal. 20 years of anger, hurt, and missed connections, all engineered by one man's need for control and his twisted sense of family honor. Why? Harris finally asked, though he wasn't sure if he was asking Thomas or the universe at large. Why tear us apart like this? Thomas's laugh was hollow, devoid of humor. Because I was the failure, the disappointment, and you were the golden child following in his footsteps. A pregnant girlfriend from the wrong side of town? That didn't fit the Whitaker legacy he was building through you. Before Harris could respond, a commotion from Micah's room drew their attention. Ruth Ann was on her feet, arguing with a hospital administrator in a crisp suit who had entered with a clipboard. What's going on? Harris demanded as he and Thomas entered the room. The administrator, a thin man named Caldwell, whom Harris recognized as one of the hospital board's most fervent cost-cutters, looked uncomfortable. Dr. Whitaker, I'm afraid there's an issue with this patient's care authorization. As the boy has no insurance and the emergency situation has been stabilized, hospital policy requires transfer to County General. That's an hour away, Ruth Ann protested, her face pale with panic. He's still on IV antibiotics. He needs to stay here. I understand your concern, ma'am, Caldwell said with practiced sympathy that didn't reach his eyes. But our resources are perfectly adequate, Harris interrupted coldly. This boy isn't going anywhere. Caldwell straightened, clearly not used to being challenged. Dr. Whitaker, with all due respect, you know the policy for uninsured patients. I'm overriding the policy, Harris stated, his voice leaving no room for argument. As chief of surgery, I have that authority. The board won't approve. Then I'll cover the costs myself, Harris snapped, surprising even himself with the vehemence of his declaration. Now get out of my patient's room. Caldwell retreated, murmuring something about discussing this further, but Harris had already dismissed him from his mind. He turned back to find Ruth Ann and Thomas staring at him with identical expressions of shock. You'd do that? Ruth Ann asked softly. Pay for his treatment. Harris looked at Micah, truly looked at him for the first time. The boy's features, relaxed in sleep, showed echoes of Thomas at that age, but there was something of his mother there too, the same determined set to his jaw, even in repose. This child was his nephew, his blood, the connection to a brother he'd thought lost, and Harris had nearly turned him away at the door. Yes, he said simply, I would. Before the conversation could continue, there was another interruption, this time from an elderly nurse named Margaret, who'd been at St. Mary's longer than anyone could remember. Dr. Whitaker, she said, slightly out of breath, your father is asking for you. He's quite insistent. Harris felt a chill run through him. How does he even know I'm here? Margaret looked confused. He said he received a call from Mr. Caldwell just now. Her eyes darted to Thomas, widening in recognition. "Oh my. Thomas? Thomas Whitaker. Is that really you?" Thomas gave her a tight smile. "Hello, Margaret. Your father doesn't know you're here," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He thinks you're still in Alaska." "Let's keep it that way," Thomas replied grimly. Harris made a quick decision. "Tell my father I'll be up shortly," he instructed Margaret. Then, turning to Thomas and Ruth Ann, "We need to talk, all of us. But first, there's something I need to do alone." As Harris headed for the elevator to the VIP floor, his hand unconsciously went to his pocket, where both letters now rested, his mother's final attempts to heal the family that Preston had fractured. The confrontation to come would not be easy, but for the first time in 20 years, Harris felt the clarity of purpose that comes from standing on the side of truth. Behind him, Thomas moved to Micah's bedside, his large hand gently brushing the hair from the boy's forehead in a gesture so tender it made Ruth Ann's eyes fill with tears. Neither of them noticed the aged figure watching from the corridor, Preston Whitaker's personal nurse, her cell phone already in hand, ready to report what she'd seen to her employer. The VIP wing of St. Mary's Hospital bore little resemblance to the rest of the facility. Plush carpeting muffled footsteps, soft lighting replaced harsh fluorescence, and original artwork adorned walls painted in soothing earth tones. It was a place designed for wealthy patients who expected their medical care to come with the comforts of a luxury hotel. Harris paused outside room 407, steeling himself for the confrontation ahead. Through the partially open door, he could hear the faint sound of a financial news program playing on the television. He knocked once and entered without waiting for a response. Preston Whitaker sat propped up in his adjustable bed, looking more like a CEO at his desk than a patient. At 78, he remained an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered despite his age, with a full head of silver hair and the same steel-blue eyes he had passed down to both his sons. Those eyes now fixed on Harris with their customary sharpness. "Finally decided to grace me with your presence," Preston said by way of greeting, muting the television with a remote. "I've been here 3 days. My own son, the chief of surgery, couldn't be bothered to visit." "I didn't know you were admitted," Harris replied evenly, closing the door behind him. "What's wrong?" Preston waved his hand dismissively. "Routine tests. The heart's getting a bit temperamental. Nothing serious." He scrutinized Harris's appearance, the damp hair, the rumpled clothes. "You look terrible. I thought I taught you better than to present yourself like this." "You taught me a lot of things," Harris said, remaining standing despite the available visitor's chair. "Like how to cut people out of my life when they become inconvenient. How to rewrite history to suit my purposes." Preston's expression didn't change, but a subtle tension crept into his shoulders. "What are you talking about?" Harris pulled his mother's letters from his pocket and placed them on the bed. "I found these tonight. One at the house, one in the hospital archives. Mother tried to tell me the truth before she died, but you made sure I never got the message." For a moment, Preston simply stared at the papers, his face impassive. Then he sighed, a sound devoid of remorse. Catherine was always sentimental. She never understood what was necessary to protect this family. "Protect?" Harris's voice rose despite his efforts to stay calm. "You destroyed us. You drove Thomas away, intercepted our letters, fed us both lies for 20 years, your own sons." "I did what had to be done," Preston said coldly. "Thomas was throwing his life away over that girl and her bastard child. And you had potential, a future. I wasn't about to let his mess drag you down too." The casual cruelty in his father's words hit Harris like a physical blow. "Micah is your grandson," he said through clenched teeth. "Your own blood." Preston's expression hardened. "The boy is nothing to me, just the product of your brother's weakness and that Blythe girl's schemes." "Her name is Ruth Ann," Harris corrected sharply, "and there were no schemes. Just a young woman left alone to raise a child because you manipulated everyone around you." A tense silence fell between them. Outside, the storm continued to rage. Rain, lashing against the windows like nature itself, was protesting Preston's callousness. "What do you want from me, Harris?" Preston finally asked, his voice weary but unyielding. "An apology, forgiveness, it's too late for all that." "I want nothing from you," Harris replied, the truth of the words settling in his chest. "But I thought you should know Thomas is here in the hospital with his son." For the first time, Preston's composure cracked. His face paled, his eyes widening in genuine shock. "Thomas is in Bayou Creek." How dare he show his face here after all this time? After all what time? Harris challenged. The time you forced him away? The time you lied to everyone about where he was? The time you robbed him of his family? Preston's jaw clenched. I did what was necessary. No, Harris said quietly. You did what was easiest for you, what maintained your precious image and control. He took a deep breath. But it ends now. Micah is staying in this hospital under my care for as long as he needs, and I'm going to make things right with Thomas and Ruth Ann. A strange expression crossed Preston's face, something between anger and fear. You can't undo 20 years of separation with a grand gesture, Harris. Some bridges stay burned. Maybe, Harris conceded, but I have to try. As he turned to leave, Preston called after him, his voice suddenly urgent. Harris, wait. There's something you should know. Something about that girl, but Harris was already closing the door, cutting off whatever manipulation his father was preparing. He'd heard enough lies for one lifetime. He was halfway to the elevator when he saw Thomas being escorted down the hallway by security, his brother's face a mask of barely contained fury. What's going on? Harris demanded, intercepting the group. This gentleman was found in a restricted area, the guard explained stiffly. He has no visitor's pass and refused to identify himself. He's my brother, Harris said firmly. I'll take responsibility for him. The guard hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. As you wish, Dr. Whitaker. When they were alone, Thomas's anger spilled over. Did you know about this? That they're trying to transfer Micah to county? What? Harris felt his stomach drop. I told Caldwell. Caldwell doesn't care what you told him, Thomas interrupted. I overheard the nurses. They're preparing transfer papers right now. Some kind of administrative override. Understanding dawned immediately. Father, Harris muttered. He still has pull with the board. They hurried back to the pediatric ICU, arriving just as a nurse was explaining the situation to a distraught Ruth Ann. I'm sorry, Ms. Blythe, but the transfer has been authorized by the administration, the nurse was saying, clearly uncomfortable with her role in this drama. We need to prepare Micah for transport to County General. This is insane, Ruth Ann protested, her voice breaking. He just had surgery. He can't be moved. Harris stepped forward, his doctor's authority radiating from every inch of him. Stop the transfer preparations immediately, he commanded. This boy is not going anywhere. The nurse looked relieved at his intervention. Dr. Whitaker, I was just following orders. Mr. Caldwell said. I don't care what Caldwell said. Harris cut her off. I'm chief of surgery and I'm telling you this patient stays. If anyone has a problem with that, they can take it up with me directly. As the nurse hurried away, Ruth Ann turned to Harris, her expression a mixture of gratitude and fear. What's happening? Why are they trying to move him? Before Harris could answer, Thomas spoke, his voice tight with controlled rage. It's Preston. He knows I'm here and he's trying to push us out. Same old tactics. Ruth Ann paled. He can't still have that much power. You'd be surprised, Harris said grimly. But this time, he's going to lose. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number. Janet? It's Harris Whitaker. I need an emergency meeting of the hospital board. Now. Yes, I know it's nearly midnight. This can't wait. After ending the call, he turned back to Thomas and Ruth Ann. I need to go fight this through proper channels. Stay with Micah. Don't let anyone move him without my direct order. As Harris strode toward the boardroom, his mind raced. He'd spent his entire career building professional capital at this hospital, playing the game his father had taught him, accumulating power and influence. Now for the first time, he was going to use all of it for something that truly mattered. Behind him, in Micah's room, Ruth Ann collapsed into a chair, overwhelmed by the emotional whiplash of the past 24 hours. Thomas knelt beside her, taking her hands in his. We should have told him years ago, she whispered. About everything. Thomas shook his head. We tried, Ruthie. My letters, your visits. Preston blocked them all. And now, he glanced at their son, small and vulnerable against the white hospital sheets, fighting for his life while adults fought over hospital politics. Now, we just need to protect Micah. The rest can wait. But as Thomas spoke those words, he couldn't know that upstairs in the VIP wing, Preston Whitaker was having a massive heart attack, clutching his chest as he reached for the call button, a faded photograph falling from his hand onto the floor. A photograph of a much younger Ruth Ann, clearly pregnant, standing between the Whitaker brothers on a summer day long past, a moment of happiness before everything fell apart. The hospital's emergency alert system blared through the corridors. its urgent tone cutting through the late-night quiet. "Code Blue, Room 407. Code Blue, Room 407. The announcement repeated, each iteration sending a fresh wave of adrenaline through the medical staff racing toward the VIP wing. Harris was halfway through his impassioned defense of Micah's continued treatment at St. Mary's when his pager vibrated. He glanced down, saw the room number, and felt the blood drain from his face. Without explanation, he bolted from the boardroom, leaving the stunned administrators staring after him. He ran through the hospital corridors, white coat flapping behind him like wings, past startled nurses and confused patients. By the time he reached room 407, a crash team was already working on his father. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the night-attending cardiologist, was calling out orders with calm efficiency as nurses performed CPR and prepared the defibrillator. "What happened?" Harris demanded, medical training overriding the emotional storm within him. "Massive MI," Vasquez replied without looking up. His nurse found him unresponsive, already in V-fib. She glanced at the monitor and nodded to the nurse holding the charged paddles. "Clear!" Preston's body jerked with the electrical shock. The monitor continued to show the jagged, chaotic rhythm of ventricular fibrillation. No pulse. "Again!" Vasquez ordered. "Clear!" Harris watched with strange detachment as they fought to restart his father's heart. The man who had manipulated his entire life, who had stolen his relationship with his brother, who had tried to deny his own grandson, was slipping away before his eyes. And Harris felt nothing. No grief, no relief, just a hollow emptiness where emotion should be. "Dr. Whitaker," Vasquez's voice pulled him back to the present. "He's stabilizing, but barely. We need to get him to the cath lab immediately." Harris nodded, stepping back to allow the team to transfer his father to a gurney. As they prepared to move him, Harris noticed something on the floor, a photograph that must have fallen during the commotion. He bent to retrieve it, turning it over in his hands. The image hit him like a physical blow. 3 smiling faces stared back at him from a sun-drenched past. Himself at 25, hair longer then, arms slung casually over Thomas's shoulders. Thomas, grinning broadly, one hand protectively resting on Ruth Ann's visibly pregnant belly, and Ruth Ann herself radiant in a summer dress, her green eyes alight with a happiness Harris had forgotten she was capable of feeling. He didn't remember this photograph being taken. It seemed impossible that such a moment of apparent harmony had existed, given everything he now knew. Yet here was the evidence in his hands, a glimpse of what might have been if his father hadn't intervened. As the crash team wheeled Preston toward the elevator, Harris remained rooted to the spot, transfixed by the photograph. He barely registered Nurse Jenkins approaching until she spoke. "Dr. Whitaker, the boy, Micah, his condition has changed." Harris snapped back to the present, the photograph clutched tightly in his hand. "Changed how?" "His fever's spiking again, and his blood pressure is dropping. Dr. Chen thinks the infection might be resistant to the antibiotics we're using." Without another word, Harris sprinted toward the pediatric ICU, the parallel medical crises of father and grandson, one man at the end of his life, one boy at the beginning, creating a surreal symmetry that wasn't lost on him. When he reached Micah's room, he found Thomas and Ruth Ann huddled together by the bed, their faces etched with fear as Dr. Chen explained the situation. "The cultures show a particularly aggressive strain of bacteria," she was saying. "We need to switch to a more targeted antibiotic regimen immediately," but she hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "But what?" Thomas pressed. "The medication he needs is extremely expensive, and without insurance authorization." "Doctor." Chen trailed off, her professional demeanor unable to completely mask her frustration with the system. "I'll cover it," Harris said immediately from the doorway. "Whatever he needs." All 3 turned to look at him. Ruth Ann's eyes were red-rimmed from crying, Thomas's jaw set in determination, and Dr. Chen's expression reflected professional relief. "I'll put in the order right away," she said, nodding to Harris before slipping past him out of the room. Left alone with Thomas and Ruth Ann, Harris took a deep breath. "Father's had a heart attack," he said quietly. "He's in critical condition." Thomas's expression remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes, a complex emotion Harris couldn't quite name. "I'm sorry," he said finally, though his tone suggested the words were more formality than genuine sentiment. Ruth Ann said nothing, her gaze returning to Micah. The boy lay still against the white sheets, his small chest rising and falling with labored breaths, his skin flushed with fever. The sight of him, fragile, innocent, fighting for his life, made the photograph in Harris's pocket feel even heavier. Harris moved to the bedside opposite Thomas and Ruth Ann. Gently, he placed his hand on Micah's forehead, feeling the heat radiating from his skin. "You don't need to know who I am," he whispered, "but I know who you are now." The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken truths and shared pain. Through the window, the first hints of dawn were breaking, pale light seeping into the room after the long, tumultuous night. "Harris," Nurse Jenkins appeared in the doorway again, her expression grave. "Mr. Caldwell is insisting on speaking with you. He says the board has made a decision about the transfer." Harris straightened, his professional mask sliding back into place. "Tell him I'll be right there." Before he could leave, Ruth Ann caught his arm. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "After everything, why help us now?" Harris met her gaze, then looked at Thomas, seeing in his brother's face the shadow of the boy he'd once known, the brother who'd taught him to fish in the bayou, who'd taken the blame when Harris broke their mother's favorite vase, who'd always been there until suddenly he wasn't. "Because I'm tired of running," Harris said simply. "Tired of pretending the past doesn't matter. Tired of being the man father molded me to be instead of the one mother hoped I'd become." He pulled the photograph from his pocket and placed it on Micah's bedside table. "I found this in Father's room. He kept it all these years, even while doing everything possible to keep us apart." Thomas picked up the photo, his breath catching as recognition dawned. "The Founders' Day picnic, the summer before." He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. "Before everything fell apart. Before lies and manipulation tore their family to shreds." "I don't remember this being taken," Harris admitted. "You were arguing with Father about your residency," Ruth Ann said softly, looking at the photo over Thomas's shoulder. "You stormed off right after. I don't think you ever even knew this photograph existed." The revelation struck Harris like another blow. Even in this captured moment of apparent harmony, the seeds of their destruction had already been sown. "I need to go deal with Caldwell," Harris said, straightening his shoulders. "I won't let them transfer Micah." As he turned to leave, Nurse Jenkins reappeared with urgent news. "Dr. Whitaker, they're calling a second code blue for your father in the cath lab. Dr. Vasquez is requesting your presence." Harris froze, caught between his dying father and his desperately ill nephew, the past and the future demanding his attention in equal measure. "Go," Thomas said unexpectedly. "Whatever else he is, he's still our father." Harris hesitated, then nodded. "I'll be back as soon as I can. Don't let them move Micah." As he rushed toward the cath lab, Harris felt something shift inside him, a certainty he hadn't experienced in years. Whatever happened with his father, whatever battles remained to be fought with the hospital administration, one thing was clear. He was finally, after 20 years of emotional exile, finding his way home. 3 days passed like a fever dream. The hospital became the center of a quiet storm as two Whitakers fought for their lives, one at the beginning of his journey, one nearing the end. Preston had survived the second cardiac arrest, but remained on life support, unresponsive machines breathing for the man who had always prided himself on never needing help from anyone. Micah's condition had stabilized after the new antibiotics took effect, his small body slowly winning the battle against the infection that had nearly claimed him. Harris moved between their rooms like a ghost, sleeping in short bursts on uncomfortable hospital couches, his once immaculate appearance now rumpled and worn. The confrontation with the board had ended in a stalemate. They couldn't override the chief of surgery's medical decisions without cause, but they'd made their disapproval clear. Harris didn't care. For the first time in his career, he was making choices based on what was right, not what was expected. On the morning of the 4th day, Harris stood at the window of Micah's room, watching the sunrise paint the Louisiana sky in shades of pink and gold. Behind him, Thomas dozed in a chair, while Ruth Ann had gone to the cafeteria for coffee. The quiet beeping of the monitors had become a comforting rhythm, each sound confirming that Micah was still fighting, still healing. "Uncle Harris?" The small, raspy voice startled Harris from his thoughts. He turned to find Micah awake, his eyes the same steel blue as his father and uncle, regarding him with curiosity. "You know who I am?" Harris asked softly, moving to the bedside. Micah nodded weakly. "Mom showed me pictures from before." Harris glanced at Thomas, who remained asleep, exhausted from the days of anxious vigil. "How long have you been awake?" "I don't know," Micah whispered. "My throat hurts." Harris poured a small cup of water and helped the boy take tiny sips. Better, Micah nodded again. Are you really a doctor? I am, Harris replied, unable to suppress a small smile at the directness of the question. Cool, Micah said with the simple appreciation of a child. Dad says you're the best doctor in Louisiana. Harris felt a lump form in his throat. Thomas had spoken well of him to Micah despite everything. Your dad exaggerates, he managed to say. Nah, Micah countered with unexpected energy. He has a newspaper about you. He keeps it in his special box. Before Harris could process this revelation, Ruth Ann appeared in the doorway, coffee cups in hand. She froze when she saw Micah awake, then rushed forward, nearly spilling the coffee in her haste. Micah, oh baby. She set the cups down and gathered her son in a gentle embrace, tears streaming down her face. You're awake. The commotion roused Thomas, who blinked in confusion before his eyes focused on his son. Micah, he breathed, as if afraid to believe it. Dad, Micah croaked, his pale face lighting up with a weak smile. Uncle Harris fixed me. Thomas's eyes met Harris's over Micah's head, a world of unspoken emotion passing between the brothers. Yeah, buddy, Thomas said thickly. He did. Dr. Chen arrived to examine Micah, confirming what they could all see. He was on the road to recovery. His fever had broken, his blood work was improving, and barring any complications, he would make a full recovery. It's almost miraculous, she told them privately. The infection was so advanced when he came in. Another few hours and... But we made it in time, Ruth Ann interjected, unwilling to hear the alternative. Yes, Dr. Chen agreed with a warm smile. You did. As she left, Harris's pager buzzed. He checked it and sighed heavily. It's father, he said to Thomas. His condition is deteriorating. They're asking if we want to continue life support. The question hung in the air, weighted with decades of pain and resentment. Thomas looked at Micah, then back to Harris. What do you think we should do? Before Harris could answer, his phone rang. Nurse Jenkins. Dr. Whitaker, you need to come to your father's room immediately. He's regained consciousness, and he's asking for you, both of you. 15 minutes later, the brothers stood at Preston Whitaker's bedside. The machines continued their rhythmic beeping, but the man they monitored was awake now, his once commanding presence diminished by illness, but his eyes still sharp with awareness. Thomas, Preston's voice was barely above a whisper, his lips dry and cracked. You came back. Thomas stood stiffly, arms crossed. Not for you. Preston closed his eyes briefly, acknowledging the blow. I know. He turned his gaze to Harris. The boy? Your nephew? He's recovering, Harris replied. No thanks to your attempts to have him transferred. A ghost of Preston's old, imperious expression crossed his face. I was wrong, he admitted, the words clearly costing him. About many things. The brothers exchanged glances of surprise. Preston Whitaker had never admitted being wrong about anything in his life. I found this, Harris said, pulling out the photograph. You kept it all these years. Why tear us apart if you had this reminder of what we could have been? Preston's hand trembled as he reached for the photo. Because I was afraid, he confessed, his voice stronger now, as if the admission itself provided energy. Afraid of losing you both. Afraid of what people would say. Afraid of not being in control. His fingers traced the faces in the image. By the time I realized what I'd destroyed, it was too late. It's still too late, Thomas said, his voice hard. 20 years too late. Preston nodded slowly. I know that too. He turned to Harris. In my safe at home. The combination is your mother's birthday. There's a letter and documents. For the boy. His breathing grew labored. I've set aside a trust for his education and a proper apology if he'll accept it someday. Harris felt conflicted emotions churning within him, anger at the manipulation, frustration that even now at the end, his father was trying to control the narrative with money and gestures. A trust fund doesn't fix what you broke, he said quietly. No, Preston agreed, surprising them again. Nothing can, but it's what I have to offer. He looked at Thomas. I never sent your letters to Harris. They're in the safe too. I wanted you to read them, he said to Harris. To understand what I kept from you, what I stole. Thomas turned away, unable to bear the sight of his father's belated remorse. I have to get back to my son, he said, walking toward the door. Thomas, Preston called after him. I was wrong about Ruth Ann too. She loved you both better than I ever deserved. Thomas paused at the door but didn't turn back. After a moment's hesitation, he left without another word. Harris remained, watching his father's labored breathing. "Why tell us now?" he asked. "Why not take these secrets to your grave?" Preston's lips curved in a sad imitation of his once confident smile. "Because your mother was right. She always was. Some truths need to be spoken, even if they can't be fixed." His hand clutched Harris's suddenly with surprising strength. "Don't make my mistakes. Don't choose pride over family. The boy, Micah, he's the future of our name, better than either of us deserved." 3 days later, they buried Preston Whitaker in the family plot on a hill overlooking Bayou Creek. The funeral was small, attended mostly by business associates and hospital board members. Thomas stood apart from the main group, with Ruth Ann and a still weak Micah, who had been granted a brief release from the hospital to attend. As the minister spoke of forgiveness and redemption, Harris found himself watching Micah. The boy leaned against his father, clearly tired but determined to be strong. In his small face, Harris could see echoes of them all: Thomas's quiet strength, Ruth Ann's resilience, even hints of Preston's stubborn jaw. But mostly, he saw hope, the promise of a future uncorrupted by the mistakes of the past. After the service, as the guests dispersed, Harris approached Thomas, Ruth Ann, and Micah. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what comes next." Thomas looked at him warily. "What do you mean?" "I'm leaving St. Mary's," Harris announced. "I'm going to open a community clinic, somewhere people can get care regardless of their insurance status." He paused. "I'd like to name it after Mother, the Blythe Center." Ruth Ann's eyes widened. "After my family?" Harris shook his head. "After our family, all of us." He knelt down to Micah's level. "What do you think? Would you like to come visit your uncle at his new clinic sometimes?" Micah considered this with the serious contemplation only children can truly manage. "Can I use your stethoscope?" Harris laughed, a genuine sound that surprised even himself. "Anytime you want, buddy." 6 months later, the Blythe Center opened its doors in what had once been a rundown community center in the heart of Bayou Creek's working-class neighborhood. Thomas had returned to Texas briefly to settle his affairs, then moved back to Louisiana with Ruth Ann and Micah, taking a job as the center's facilities manager. Ruth Ann worked at the front desk, her natural warmth making patients feel welcome from the moment they arrived. On a warm spring afternoon, Harris stood in the corridor of the clinic, watching as Micah ran past him, laughing, a toy stethoscope bouncing around his neck. The boy had made a full recovery, his natural resilience overcoming the scars of his illness. Behind him trailed a group of other children, patients and siblings who had turned the clinic's waiting area into an impromptu playground. "He looks more like you every day," Harris said as Thomas joined him. Thomas smiled, watching his son. Poor kid. The brothers stood in comfortable silence, the decades of separation slowly healing with each passing day. They weren't the same people they had been before Preston's manipulation tore them apart. Too much time had passed, too many wounds had been inflicted, but they were finding their way back to a new kind of brotherhood, built on honesty and shared purpose. "Do you ever regret it?" Thomas asked suddenly. "Giving up your prestigious hospital position for this place?" Harris thought about the question, about the life he'd left behind, the cold, sterile corridors of St. Mary's, the political maneuvering, the constant pressure to conform to his father's vision of success. Then he looked around at the vibrant, messy, human reality of the Blythe Center, at his brother by his side, at Micah's infectious laughter echoing down the hall. "Not for a second," he answered truthfully. "Some cures don't come with medicine. They come from the courage to face the past." As if hearing his words, Micah turned and waved at them both, his smile illuminating the corridor brighter than any sunshine could. In that moment, Harris knew with absolute certainty that he had finally found his way home. What would you do if you discovered that your entire life had been built on lies? If the walls you carefully constructed to protect yourself were actually keeping you from the only people who truly mattered? Dr. Harris Whitaker faced this devastating truth when a single name on a medical form shattered 20 years of carefully maintained distance. Sometimes the hardest person to forgive isn't someone who wronged you, but yourself. The courage it takes to face our past mistakes, to acknowledge our role in the pain of others, is perhaps the most difficult journey we can undertake. Yet, as we've seen in this story, it's often the only path to healing, not just for ourselves, but for all those whose lives are intertwined with ours. Family bonds, even when stretched to breaking point by decades of silence and manipulation, have a remarkable resilience if we're brave enough to nurture them back to health. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and follow our channel for more powerful stories that remind us of our shared humanity. Remember, it's never too late to make things right with those who matter most. The most profound healing often begins with 3 simple words: I was wrong,